The Bible, of course, isn't a book. The Bible is a collection of books. It's 66 books that have been, or letters that have been pulled together. It's got about 40 different authors. It's been written over about 1,500 years. And of course, up until I think it was 325 AD, there was no thing called the Bible. There were just lots of kind of religious documents. And so yeah, so basically, the Bible was pulled together, and initially, it would have all been oral. It would have just been conversations. In the Eastern culture, unlike today in the Western culture, we have social media. We write things down. We have records of things. Well, in Eastern and ancient times, that wasn't happening, and so the way in which things were kind of relayed from generation to generation, it was an oral tradition. So people would sit around and they would have conversations and they would talk and they would repeat wise sayings. They would kind of expound on their genealogies, of where their tribe came from, and so it wasn't so much that it was written down, but of course some things were. And so when Jesus came, again, stories were just being told around Jesus. But after Jesus had died and had risen, and some of those followers were getting older and some were dying, they decided that they would write an account of the life of Jesus, which is where we have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so they were around for people to read, for churches to look at. A man called Paul wrote letters to churches, and so some of those were collated too. And it was in 325 AD that a group of Christians from different churches from around Asia Minor and Jerusalem and other places came together. It was known as the Council of Nicaea. And they were the ones who then decided which of the letters and accounts of Jesus' life was going to be incorporated in what was known as the canon of Scripture, it was what was widely accepted as being true. So some letters and some gospels, such as the Gospel of Thomas, was discarded. They weren't deemed. Basically, they had a really strong criteria as to how those letters and books should be included. One of them was, especially when it came to the New Testament, was it written by either an eyewitness of Jesus, one of his followers, one of his disciples, or someone who was like an apprentice to that person? And so Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. John was a disciple of Jesus. Mark, it's believed that he recorded what Simon Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, had kind of told him to record. And so you get these different accounts of Jesus' life. And so they were pulled together. So they had to be um, whether someone was close to Jesus. The second one was it was linked with whether all of the churches across the known world at that time were using those books, those passages, those stories, whether they were all in use, and whether some were kind of deemed a bit dodgy, then they just weren't included. And it had to be consistent with Jesus' teaching. And so a man called Thomas, there's a gospel according to Thomas that hasn't made its way into the Bible. There are copies of it. And if you were to read it, it has some very weird sections to it, such as Mary, as in Jesus' mother, for her to get to heaven, she had to become a man. Yeah, exactly. So pretty glad that one wasn't included, hey? So because of those bizarre things, they weren't included because it didn't correspond with the teaching of Jesus. And so that's how the Bible came together as we know it, of those 66 books. And we know that it hasn't been changed from those original documents because of this thing called textual criticism, which basically means you have the earliest copy of a manuscript as close to when it was first written, and how many copies there are around to be able to say, is this true? Is this true? And so back in 1940, there were a whole load of Old Testament documents discovered. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of you will have heard of this, where a shepherd boy was throwing stones, and he suddenly heard, as he threw it into a cave, he heard kind of a pottery smash. And they went up and they discovered the whole book of Isaiah, which is one of the prophetic books in the Old Testament. And they were able to then put that against what they'd originally had. And sure enough, it was exactly the same. And so that we know that what was originally written, what we have now, is true. And so I think we can rely upon the Bible. I think we can trust it because it makes a claim about itself that it's inspired by God and that it's the best way in which God speaks to us today. So I think it's consistent, has a consistent narrative. It has real integrity about the documents that we have, and ultimately, it's a document that has changed so many millions of people's lives. And so for me, I trust it. I build my life on what it says because it's through that we discover who Jesus is. So a man called uh, John, he was really clear in what he had to say about why he'd written what he'd written. He says, from the very first day we were there, taking it all in. We heard it with our own ears, saw it with our own eyes, verified it with our own hands. The word of life, that's Jesus, appeared right before our eyes. We saw it happen. And now we're telling you in the most sober prose that what we witnessed was incredibly this: the infinite life of God, that's Jesus himself, took shape before us. We saw it, we heard it, and now we're telling you so that you can experience it along with us. So the Bible is given so that we can get to know God and have a relationship with him. And that's why I think we can trust it.